can start whenever you're ready.
Good morning. Welcome to this installment of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's monthly webcast series. My name is Sarisha Ganta. I'm an attorney with the partnership. We're excited to have with us today Robert Lane, Deputy Director of the Commission, let me make sure I have the whole name right here, the Georgia Government Transparency and Campaign Finance Commission, here to speak with us about Georgia's lobbying registration and reporting requirements. We're so thrilled to have him here to speak with us about this topic. We'll know this inside and out. So thank you, Robert, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
A little bit before Robert jumps into the substance of today's topic, I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Pro Bono Partnership by Atlanta. Our mission is to provide free legal assistance to community-based nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. We match eligible organizations with volunteer lawyers from the leading corporations and law firms of Atlanta, and they will assist nonprofits with their business law matters. Our clients are 501c3 organizations within the metro Atlanta area that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals and are otherwise unable to afford legal services. If you would like more information about our organization or are interested in becoming a client, please go to our website. You can find an application for assistance there. Also on our website, there's a wealth of resources, including articles, past webcasts, and this webcast today will also be posted on our website in a couple of days. And a brief disclaimer, today's webcast is copyright PBPA, and the information that Robert will be sharing with you today is general information. If you have specific questions for your nonprofit, please reach out to your attorney. And now, I'll turn it to Robert.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, and I'm glad to be here with the Pro Bono Partnership. And I'm glad I have this opportunity to speak with you, the members of the regulated community who may be engaging in lobbying. What I'm hoping to do today is to go over the general requirements and registration requirements that the Campaign Finance Act imposes on people who wish to engage in lobbying. As a general rule, a lot of nonprofits who engage in lobbying aren't going to qualify as lobbyists, and that gets a little complicated. But to start out, just a little bit of a background on the Campaign Finance Act. Our commission came into being in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And at that time, we were known as the Georgia Campaign Finance and Disclosure Commission. Everyone decided that was a horrible name, and that was changed to the State Ethics Commission in the 1980s, although we never did anything dealing with ethics, and we still don't. Never mind the fact that you would email me at ethics@ga.gov. And in 2014, our name was again changed to the mouthful, which is the Georgia Government Transparency and Campaign Finance Commission. We're still trying to change the name to something a little shorter that will fit on the state seal and, more importantly, on the checks that people have to write us in order to register as lobbyists. But our lobbying code really came into force in the 1980s, and then in 2014, it was strengthened to include very harsh penalties, and that was done for a number of reasons. Namely, there was a good senator who was engaging in some re-election campaigning, and he decided that the act was just a little too vanilla for his taste, and it sailed through. So what I always tell people who are engaged in lobbying is you have to make sure you dot all your I's, cross all your T's, or you're looking at having some severe penalties that are imposed by law, and the commission doesn't have a lot of discretion to waive those. For example, late fees for one misfiled report can reach up to $13,000. And unfortunately, it's heavy-handed, and we are attempting to address that with legislation, but there's not a lot of desire to reduce those fees and penalties. So with that, some helpful definitions for everyone to understand. The definition of lobbyist in the code, it's not very clear, and I always say it's complicated because there are about 8 different ways that you can qualify to be a lobbyist and be subject to reporting requirements under the Campaign Finance Act. So moving along, what you have to remember as a lobbyist, we're only really concerned if you are lobbying 2 types of people, that being public officers or public employees. Public officers in Georgia are any elected official, so that's the governor all the way down to your county and city councilors. But also you have to remember, if you're talking with a public employee that has discretion over the hiring and firing of vendors, then that also can constitute lobbying. And a good example of that type of public employee that would be a public officer under the act would be me, because I have discretionary authority over the hiring and firing of vendors. So if you were trying to attempt to lobby the commission to adopt a case management system or some other type of vendor service, you would have to register as a state agency lobbyist before you could pitch your sales system to our agency. Now, this is also kind of a misnomer in our act. We have a lot of misnomers, but we define state agency within the Campaign Finance Act is any branch of state government. So that's every state branch of government, every state agency, and all of its government subdivisions and subsidiaries. So counties and city governments count, and all of their subsidiaries as well. So if you're lobbying the Department of Aviation in the city of Atlanta, you would qualify as lobbying. Next, a vendor is, it's all encompassing. It's any person who sells or contracts with the state agency for the provision of goods. Now, to keep our theme going of unhelpful definitions, the legislature has defined lobbying as the activity of a lobbyist while acting in that capacity. And we'll kind of come back to that in a little more detail as to what the commission has really kind of narrowed lobbying down to be. Because with such a broad and overarching definition, it's very hard to figure out, is what I'm doing lobbying? And we'll have a couple of hypotheticals a little later on to help you better parse that down and see exactly where the areas are that you need to be careful. Now, as far as lobbying activity, the code, once again, is a little unclear, and we're looking to change that with legislation coming up in the new legislative session in 2020. But you have what are known as expenditures. And these expenditures are the purchase and payment of any goods or services to influence legislation. And what I always tell people, this is when you take someone out to dinner. This is when you take someone out to lunch. This is if you buy gifts for the office, if you do a Chick-fil-A day at the Capitol, which that tends to be very popular with the legislators and their staffs. That's deemed to be an expenditure, and that comes with uncapped set of regulations. Under the Campaign Finance Act, those expenses are capped at $75 per person per day. And that's the max you can spend on those types of expenditures. Then you have what are called lobbying expenditures. We'd like to rename that to be known as non-restricted expenditures, and then have the prior expenditures known as restricted expenditures. But for lobbying expenditures, you have no cap on what you are able to spend on those. And I'll give some more detailed and concrete examples of that. For example, if you invite every member of the House Ethics Committee to a luncheon, there is no dollar cap on that amount of money that's being spent, but you are only given one of those free luncheons where there is no limit per year. And then the other thing you have to watch out for is that you invite every member of the House Ethics panel. You can't invite just the Republicans, and you can't just invite the Democrats. It has to be every member of the committee. Another thing to watch out for is you have to make sure that the committee that you are inviting is registered with the House and Senate Ethics Committee and it's approved. And that also applies for caucuses. You will find in the Georgia General Assembly, there are a lot of people who claim to have a caucus, but they're not properly registered. As of last session, the only registered caucuses that are recognized are the House Democratic Caucus, the House Republican Caucus, and then the Black Legislative Caucus. Other than that, so for example, if you have somebody who says, I'm with the DeKalb County Legislative Caucus, no such legal entity exists, so you can't invite out the entire DeKalb County Legislative Caucus for a lobbying expenditure. The normal limits apply to them until such time as they're properly registered. Now, in heading back to who is a lobbyist and that unhelpful definition, it's always a natural person, and you'll see in our code, it constantly refers to a natural person. So there's no such thing as a corporate lobbying entity. So it always has to be a human. And the first one is a natural person who receives or expects to receive more than $250 per calendar year in compensation or in reimbursement for undertaking to promote or oppose legislation. Now, That's easy when you're part of a lobbying firm to figure out whether you qualify. But for a nonprofit who sends their executive director to go support or oppose legislation, the commission has interpreted that part of the code section to include the salary the executive director is drawing. So basically, you have to break down your hourly rate and determine when you cross the $250 threshold. So if you're only going to go meet with legislators for 2 hours, and that's the only time you're going to be supporting or opposing legislation, then you're not going to reach that $250 threshold. Now, if you are going to spend the entire session pushing or opposing legislation, and you're drawing your normal salary, you're going to cross that $250 threshold. You're going to have to go ahead and register with us as a lobbyist.
Quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you register after the fact if you don't know before you start the conversations whether or not you're going to be spending 2 hours versus 20?
You can register after the fact. Now, we tend to say that if we do look at intent, although the Campaign Finance Act is a strict liability statute, the commission does use its powers under 2156 to exercise basically the prerogative of mercy and not punish people for inadvertent violations of the Campaign Finance Act. And so it's not a pure strict liability. Although it's in writing strict liability, we don't in practice enforce it as such. And we do prefer that people self-report. Self-reporting will always bring you a lot more mitigation. Generally, it's a compliance over a now you know, in the future, you'll do better. So, absolutely. And I forgot to mention this earlier. If y'all have questions, please feel free to type them in. I'm happy to take them as we go forward because, as was mentioned earlier, I know this stuff backwards and forwards. I tend to live it way too often, so I sometimes jump around and skip. And sometimes a little more information is helpful. Another way that you can trigger lobbyist reporting requirements is if you make lobbying expenditures, and if you'll remember, those are the free, I'm calling them free, but they're the unrestricted, unlimited amount of money that you can spend. If you spend more than $1,000 on those expenses, then you have to register with us as a lobbyist. Additionally, it becomes a little trickier because we have varying levels of lobbying. We have 4 levels. There's state lobbying, state agency lobbying, county and municipal lobbying, and then you have vendor/state transportation board lobbying. And each one of those in the code has different reporting requirements and reporting schedules. I'm always going to reference you back to the Campaign Commission's website because we have the filing schedules contained under the filer info section, and that is the best place to find your schedule because even though I deal with this every day, I couldn't tell you the exact schedule that is followed. What I can tell you is that for state level lobbyists, when the General Assembly's in session, you have 2 reports per month, and after that you have a report that's due once a month. The good news is that once you have completed lobbying, you are not required to remain a lobbyist for the entirety of the year. So when the General Assembly goes to its last session and does sine die, you can terminate your lobbyist registration the next day, file your last report, and that will suspend all of your lobbying reporting requirements for the rest of the year. So once you register, it's not an entire year deal. You can register at the beginning of the year, you can register in the middle of the year, and by the same token, you can quit at any time. That'll terminate the remainder of your lobbying reporting requirements. One thing to watch out, though, is if you are a lobbyist at another level than state or county, you don't have a spending threshold. You have to go ahead and register as a lobbyist beforehand. So if you are a person who is being compensated to promote or oppose legislation or a regulatory rule at the county or city level, then you're going to have to go ahead and register with us prior to actually engaging in lobbying because you don't have that $250 registration threshold. Now, if you are only getting reimbursed by your nonprofit for your expenses as opposed to drawing a salary, say you're a pure volunteer, but you're getting per diems or you're getting mileage reimbursement, what have you, that's when you have a $1,000 threshold for having to report if you're doing local or municipal lobbying. And then for state agency lobbying, so if you're calling me trying to get commission to adopt a new vendor or a new goods and services program, you have to go ahead and register prior to that. And I think that basically covers how you trigger being defined as a lobbyist. Now, as far as who can register as a lobbyist, it's any person above the age of 18. As I've said before, there's no corporate entities. The only other restriction we have is that you cannot be a convicted felon within the past 10 years. So if you've had a felony conviction or the code goes on to describe what's known as a crime of moral turpitude. So it's not a felony in one state, but it would be a felony in the state of Georgia because it falls in like embezzlement or theft, petty theft, larceny. Those issues in another state would transfer here as a felony that would prohibit you from being able to register as a lobbyist. I also jokingly say that people that should not register as lobbyists are your interns, assistants, office managers, attorneys, and volunteers. If they are not going to be representing the agency, but they're assisting the lobbyists, there's no point in them registering. We've had a little bit of a problem with that in the past, where a lobbyist would come and they will bring their army of interns and register them all as lobbyists, even though they're not going to be speaking on behalf of the group that's being represented. Also, we've had a problem, it's known as grassroots lobbying, and I jokingly call those the sign holders. If you just have people that are coming to support your nonprofit and they're holding a sign that says, House Bill 1 stinks, they're not required to register as a lobbyist. They can stand there and hold a sign. There's no requirement that they register as a lobbyist. Now, as far as trying to dive into the weeds a little bit into what is lobbying, you may recall that unhelpful definition earlier. The code defines lobbying as any act by a lobbyist while engaged in lobbying. It's very unhelpful. What the commission has tried to do is narrow that down as to that a person is either promoting or opposing legislation or regulatory rules, and that the person is engaging in lobbying expenditures or those limited expenditures. So it's not just you're showing up and having a chat. And also the commission generally says that you have to have an overt act in order to promote legislation or regulatory rules. So it's not just an off-the-cuff remark. That's not going to trigger a lobbying event. So if you're having a chat with a legislator in the hallway and you say, you know what, I think House Bill 1 stinks, and that's the end of your conversation as they're running to a committee hearing somewhere, you have not just crossed into the lobbying world, made an off-the-cuff remark. It's not an overt act. The only thing I would caution is that the requirement for an overt act by the commission does not necessarily mean that you have to do a direct appeal to oppose or promote legislation. So we don't have a magic words test. Some states you have to say, you know, Senator, I really want you to support House Bill 1, or I want you to kill House Bill 1. And if you don't say support, kill, defeat, whatever, it's not considered a lobbying act. In Georgia, if you sit with the legislator during lunch and you explain the public policy rationale to support or oppose House Bill 1, then you're committing lobbying, because everyone knows exactly what you're trying to do, and it's not that hidden. But like I said, some states, some of our sister states have a magic words test where if you don't say a correct combination of words, then you can get around lobbying. Now, this is where we kind of get into the hypotheticals, the overt act in practice. And I hope this gives a little bit of a better picture of how nuanced the overt act can be. In the first hypothetical, we have lobbyist Jane takes Representative Mike out to lunch, i.e. she's paying for the lunch, and it's to celebrate Mike's re-election after a hard-fought primary and general election. Just by way of background, Jane and Mike have known each other since law school, and at the lunch, Jane and Mike talk about everything except legislation. Did Jane lobby Mike? And if you said the answer is no, then you're right, because public officers are allowed to have friends, including lobbyists as friends. Sorry, I have to pick on the lobbyists because I have to endure all the lawyer jokes. So it's nice to have someone else to pick on. For the next hypothetical, same fact pattern, except at the lunch, Jane mentions that she's working on House Bill 1, and that the client she's representing really hopes that she can get it passed without it being catfished or Christmas tree. And if you're going to be engaging in lobbying, you know what that means. But for people who are uninitiated in lobbying, Catfish is where they gut your bill and then they stuff it full of things that have absolutely nothing to do with the title. The joke is it's for the children, even though it's, about a tax regulations that has nothing to do with children. Or Christmas tree is where they hang a bunch of amendments on your bill, so it also says it's for the children, and it will actually help the children, but they tacked on tax regulations, other highway regulations, so it just sails on through. Both of those acts generally kill a bill because most legislators don't want to push through a bill that's got a bunch of tacked on Christmas ornaments, and or of course if it's zombie bill, it won't make it through. But anyway, back to Jane and Mike. Um, if do you think she lobbied? The answer is maybe. The truth is the commission would want to know more information. So if the commission received a complaint from the outside, and just to warn you in advance, there are people over in the legislature during session that will walk around and see if you're wearing a lobbying badge, trying to eavesdrop on what you're talking about, and they will snitch on you. They will send us a complaint saying Jane has lobbied Senator so-and-so on Senate Bill 1. She wasn't wearing a lobbying badge. Investigator for violations of the Campaign Finance Act. So in this instance, we'd want to talk to Jane and we'd want to talk to Representative Mike and see exactly what was talked about, and we'd want more information. In the next hypothetical, same fact pattern, Jane and Mike are still at lunch, except in this one, Jane is explaining the public policy rationale to Mike so that he can defeat House Bill 1. The only thing is her client doesn't care about House Bill 1. She's hired to deal with Senate Bill 23. Did Jane lobby Mike? And the answer is no. Jane is entitled to have and share her opinion about House Bill 1 with her friend Mike. There's no lobbying there. Just because she's a lobbyist doesn't mean she has to check her opinions at the door. And then the final hypothetical is Mike and Jane are still at lunch, and they're discussing House Bill 1, and the only difference is that at this meeting, she explains the public policy rationale behind House Bill 1 that her client is supporting. Did Jane lobby Mike? And the answer is yes, she did, because she, under the commission's definition, has committed an overt act of lobbying. Now, as far as lobbying activities, this is where we tend to find that lobbyists and should-be lobbyists have the biggest problem. And this is a real unknown area of the law, and I don't think the legislators are paying very close attention. And I'm not afraid to say that because I've told them that too, both the House and Senate Ethics Committees. The law actually allows the commission to punish legislators for taking unauthorized lobbying expenditures. So you'll run into legislators that are very skittish in talking with you, especially if you don't have a lobbyist badge, because they're afraid that one of those people who are floating around the legislature are going to report them as well for taking unauthorized lobbying expenditures. And so this is just kind of a crash course. If you have any questions about can I or should I, please feel free to give the commission a call. We actually have an education department and staff that is completely tasked with answering all of your what ifs and but questions. And if you're afraid to tell us it's you, we're happy to talk about your friends who are dealing with the same issues that you are. We're quite used to it. And we'd rather talk with you on the front end than on the back end when we actually have to sue you. Because also, if we're having to drag in legislators to ask them what were they doing with you, it's really going to harm your lobbying efforts to promote or oppose your bill. But all that being said, the details of what lobbying activities are allowed. These are the following activities you can do irrespective of cost, and I've kind of briefly touched on them. You can have dinners, luncheons, other events with members of the general authority or a government authority when all the members are invited. So if you want to take out every member of the Campaign Finance Commission for dinner at the Ocean Air to oppose or promote a regulatory rule, that's perfectly allowed. You just have to invite everybody. Like I've said before, just remember you have to make sure that you're only doing one event and that the grouping is recognized by the House or Senate Ethics Committee, or it is already a statutorily established committee. So if you're doing Civil Non-Justice Committee, they don't have to register. They're a statutorily created committee of the House and Senate, so they're free to go. As I've said, there's no dollar limit. The sky's the limit. Do whatever you need to do. You can also reimburse the payment for actual and reasonable expenses provided to public officers and their necessary public employee staff members, and that includes their spouse.
Quick question going back to,
Sure.
they can provide promotional items to public officers that are provided to members of the general public. Can those be shared with only certain individuals, or should they be shared with everyone in the general?
For the promotional items, you can pick and choose who you give them to. The only restriction is that the promotional item has to be available to members of the general public. So if you have, I don't know, a laser pointer that has your group's name put on the side of it, you can hand that out to the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and that's perfectly fine, provided that you make it available to other members of the public. Like if you set up a little kiosk, if people can just come by and grab it, then it's fair game. Now we have had instances before, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, in the real world hypotheticals of what happens, where people have claimed things are promotional items and they're clearly not promotional items. So it'll be interesting. But you'll also find that there will be legislators that will want, and they'll hint very strongly that they'd like to go on an educational event. And that's because the trip can be paid for out of pocket by the group that's lobbying them, and there's no dollar restriction. The only restriction is you can't pay for their golfing events or any other entertainment expenses, so no concerts, no tickets to shows or sporting events. And that has an exception as well. But you're able to also send them, and their spouse is allowed to go on that trip, and it can be an all expenses paid trip. Additionally, the other items that can be done are awards and plaques, discounts if they are provided to any normal customer, food and beverages produced in Georgia, so you can give legislators all the craft beer and peanuts that they can handle. And that's actually something that happens every year with the legislators. In fact, I know a few legislators who complain that they are sick to death of peanuts and craft beer. But that's okay, I can stock my fridge. And then, of course, campaign contributions. This is an exception to a lot of our sister states. Campaign contributions are allowable in Georgia from lobbyists to legislators. Just know that a legislator cannot accept campaign contributions during session. So you can do it before session or you can do it after session. Now, you don't have a prohibition on making a campaign contribution during session, but if they take it, they will get in trouble. So just know that it's kind of a faux pas. If you try and make a campaign contribution, they will run for the hills as fast as they can, because that's the one area of the Campaign Finance Act they know probably better than I do. Exactly when session starts and ends, because that's when they can and cannot take money. And that'll also kind of tip them off that you're a brand new newbie, because they'll be like, "Oh, that's sweet, you're trying to give me money." No. And then we've had a few who will say, just date it for the day after session, and I'll take it then. Now, there are some activities that are strictly prohibited, no exceptions, no cap. You just can't do it. And the first, it's got a very long definition, but it's basically the transfer of money or the purchase of items to influence a legislator to vote on a particular issue. It also has the same kind of language as the bribery statute in Georgia, so it is a crime. Not only under the Campaign Finance Act, but it's actually a felony under Georgia Criminal Code as well. So, no bribes. The other one is that you cannot do tickets for athletic events, concerts, or golf tournaments. The only exception to that being is that the Board of Regents is allowed to give tickets to Georgia Tech and UGA football events. And the exception falls in to public employees and government agencies aren't required to register as lobbyists, even if they are engaged in lobbying. So if you don't fall under the registration requirements, then the limitations of the code do not apply to you. So if you're not getting paid $250 to go lobby and you're not getting reimbursements of $1,000, then the lobbying code does not apply to you, and neither do the restrictions.
I have a question about the golf tournament.
Yes.
What if it's not the individual holding the golf tournament that gives them a ticket, but someone else who gives them a ticket to the golf tournament hosted by this organization?
As long as the organization's not paying for the ticket, and as long as you are not using the other person as a straw man, then there is no problem in that person giving them the ticket. So, for example, if you had a golf tournament that's being put on by Autism Speaks, and a supporter of Autism Speaks invites the legislator and has bought 5 tickets, gives the legislator 1 ticket, you have no control over that. Members who support your organization are allowed to use their influence to try and bring people along. As long as Autism Speaks didn't donate the ticket or pay it, then no problem. We've talked a good bit about the $75 cap. Anything that is not one of those unlimited expenses that I've talked to you about or that is strictly prohibited is fair game, provided that you keep it at the $75 per person per day. And that kind of brings us to the what if, and this is probably the line of questioning that we get the most, because that $75 cap is applied to the transactions lobbyists use the most in their arsenal for lobbying. And the question we always get is, if I take 4 legislators out to lunch, what's my limit? And the limit is $300, and that's including your tax. It's $75 per person per day. And then we always get the, well, what if one representative versus me? Because there are about 10 legislators I can think of off the top of my head that will reimburse a lobbyist for every expense they get because they have made a pledge never to take a lobbying expense. Even though that person reimbursed you, his $75 or her $75 doesn't transfer to the other legislators you took out. So it's the amount would reduce to $225. You can say, well, I took 4 out. Well, yeah, you did, but we reimbursed you. The limit applies to the person, not to the grouping. Now, there's also been the question of what do I do if I exceed the $75 cap? And the response is, well, you just confessed to us, don't exceed the $75 cap. There's no way really around it except for one inventive way, and we'll kind of touch on that in a minute. Another question we always get is, what if I invite all the members of a committee or a caucus, but only some of the members show up? For example, if I invited the Democratic and Republican caucus, and only the independents showed up. I don't think we have any independents in the General Assembly, but if we did, and they were the only ones who showed up, that's fine. They're just going to get the best dinner ever. Not every member has to show up. You just have to make the invitation. So if people don't want to show up, they don't have to. I am picking on the DeKalb County Legislative Caucus a little bit because I've told them this for 5 years. Unless and until they register with the House and Senate Ethics Committees, if someone suggests that you go take out a county legislative caucus, and it's not just DeKalb, it's all of them, or the South Georgia Legislative Caucus, you're not allowed to take them out for that unlimited group event because they're not properly registered. It'd be the $75 per person per day. And so in that instance, what you'd have to do is just find a very polite way to decline and hint that they need to go register or give us a call. Now, as far as real life examples, I think I have changed all the facts and at least the names to protect folks that we haven't convicted yet. But in one instance, we had a lobbyist who called the campaign finance staff and wanted to know if they could give out promotional items. And of course, we explained yes, and we were going through the listing. And thankfully, a member of our education department said, well, what's the item, if I might ask? And the gentleman said, it's a Mont Blanc pen. And of course, this member of staff said, oh, okay. Does your client normally give those out as to members of the public? And the lobbyist said he'd call back. He didn't call back, so we called him back. And we discovered that, of course, the client did not, on a regular basis, hand out Mont Blanc pens. That wasn't allowed because it's not available to members of the public. You'd be surprised how many people actually try that tack. We've had Baccarat crystal, we've had some gold-plated items, but generally the lobbyist realizes when I go ask for a public sample, they realize that it's not going to work. We did have one instance where a lobbyist took 2 legislators out to a very nice dinner at the Ocean Air. The cost of the dinner for just the legislators exceeded $200. Now, this lobbyist was inventive. She called her campaign finance lawyer, who shall remain nameless because I don't need him helping people get out of trouble, at least before we catch them. And the Ocean Air agreed to bill $150 on one day and then bill the remainder of the bill on the following day. So she stayed within the limit of $75 per person per day. So that's a little inventive way to get around the amount. Now, when I say per person, per event, per day, that means that you, in theory, could take the legislator to breakfast, lunch, and dinner for $75 per event, per person, per day. So it's not pure $75 per day. That has caused a little bit of confusions with members of the regulated community before, but it's per event too. Now, as far as what does a lobbyist do when they realize they have violated the Campaign Finance Act, we had one gentleman who realized that he had done something incorrect. He actually reported what his violations were, and he came before the commission, and there was no punishment. All that we required is that the legislators reimburse the lobbyists for the unauthorized lobbying expenditure. And one of the main reasons we did that is because the lobbyist really had absolutely no idea that he had violated the law. Additionally, the legislators involved were also uninformed as to what their violations would have been. And the violation would have been a punishment not only against Bob, but the legislators as well for unauthorized lobbying expenses. And frankly, none of them had mental culpability for it. So since it was self-disclosed in the commission, our main focus is to encourage compliance and disclosure. So if that's being done on a self-reported basis, we don't want to discourage someone from that self-reporting basis. Now, as far as what must be disclosed, if you have to register as a lobbyist, you're going to start regulating more tightly, because we have noticed a slide in compliance where members of the regulated community are putting down their consulting firm and not disclosing who their actual clients are and what issues they are either promoting or opposing. So it's not a loophole. We looked at the code a number of different ways, and it actually doesn't work. Now, as far as the who can or what levels can be lobbied, of course, we've talked about is there's the state level, which are all the executive officers, as well as the General Assembly, the state agency, name a state agency in the alphabet soup world, that counts, local level, cities and states, and the State Transportation Board. How you register as a lobbyist, we've tried to make it as simple as possible. If you had previously registered as a lobbyist, you can register online. Just go to ethics.state.ga.us, and we'll go ahead and allow you to register online. You just log in with your own lobbying credentials. You don't even have to come in and take a new picture, and we will mail you your badge. Or you can come by and pick it up if you'd like to just visit. Now, if you are a new lobbyist, you're going to have to come and apply in person. The main reason we make you come and apply in person is because in order to lobby at any state of Georgia or city or county property, you have to have a lobbying badge and you have to wear it. It identifies who you are, who your client is. It has your picture on it. Now, you can get as many badges as you want. We actually have one lobbyist who gets 4. As he jokingly says, he has one for his car, one for his wife's car, one to lose, and one to wear. Now, each badge costs, I believe it's, the registration fee is $20, and then we make you pay a $10 badge fee for each badge after the first one. So it's not too cost prohibitive. But registration time is Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 4 p.m., and it's currently open. So you don't have to wait for the legislative session. You can come anytime that we are open for normal business.
Question. So the lobbyist registration, does that follow the individual person, or do they need like a different badge for each client that they're representing?
Sure. If you have just one client, we will print the client name on the badge. If you have multiple clients, your badge will just identify you as a lobbyist, and it won't list your individual client. Now, as far as the lobbying schedule, I jokingly said it, but I'm dead serious. The best way to find the schedule and maintain it is to go to our website to the filing schedule. We keep that up to date, and you should be able to export it into Siri or any of your calendaring software, so you can set up your reminders to file. Just as a word of caution, the commission is not that forgiving when people miss a reporting requirement, because we have tried to make it as easy as possible to know when those dates are. Now, the commission has never imposed that $13,000+ fine for filing late, but they have on a regular basis imposed a fine of $275 for each report that is late, simply because we have tried to make it extremely convenient and easily accessible to know when you should file. Now, this is probably the most important part for nonprofits, is who should not register as lobbyists. And we've had a little bit of a problem with people who don't qualify as lobbyists wanting to register so they can get a badge. Now, this badge does nothing for you except it says lobbyist in your name, and it has your picture. and it's a very ugly badge. We don't even make it look pretty, but it doesn't open any doors. It doesn't get you through security. It's not like TSA pre-clear. It really does nothing but identify you as a lobbyist and make you have to file lobbying reports. So our standard advice has always been, if you don't qualify as a lobbyist, don't register, because it's more of a headache than it's worth for you. So if you're not going to be compensated for your work in the amount of $250 per calendar year, don't register. If you're a pure volunteer representing your organization and you're not getting paid and you're not getting reimbursed at $10,000, don't bother with registration. You'll be perfectly fine. And if it causes legislators to be a little skittish, just call and let us know who that legislator is, and I'll be happy to reach out to them and let them know that, the person who's representing organization X isn't required to be a registered lobbyist. They can take the meeting. We've actually had legislators call to confirm that before, or they'll have their assistant reach out just to confirm that they can meet with, so-and-so group X, because the legislator's afraid of us knocking on their door. The old Ronald Reagan joke of "I'm with the government and I'm here to help" really applies to our legislators, because when they hear that we're calling from campaign finance, they never take the call unless we tell them it's for a really good news, like we're giving them a refund, or there's a subpoena on the way. Then we'll take the phone call. Additionally, the other people who are exempted from registering as lobbyists are if you were invited by a member of a committee or a government body to come testify. So if, for example, your group has been invited to send a representative to the Committee on Healthcare, you're allowed to go. You don't have to register as a lobbyist. You're allowed to speak. Attorneys representing their clients don't have to register. Support staff who are not engaging in lobbying, so if you're taking your assistant to come help you with your activities as a registered lobbyist, they don't have to register. And then people who are just communicating their personal views do not have to register as lobbyists. Another little quirk in the law is a person it calls the person a bona fide salesperson. Doesn't have to register as a lobbyist. The best example we've seen for this in real life is a lobbyist is hired by Prudential, and Prudential wants to become the actuary for the employee retirement system. The actuary is not required to register as a lobbyist, even though they're doing the sales pitch. So what will happen is the lobbyist will come and say to the employee retirement system board, "I'm John Doe, I represent Prudential, and here's James, who's going to talk about how they're great at being actuaries." So the salesperson doesn't have to register. What we tend to advise those entities to do is go ahead and hire a lobbyist to go ahead and make the introductions, and then your staff and salespeople can just run with it without having to register as a lobbyist.
I have a question about who should not register. You have listed people who are just communicating their personal views. Where do you draw the line? Because especially for our clients, a lot of the staff or executive directors are very passionate about the mission, and it's their personal view, but they also think HB1 is horrible and
Now this is where the commission, probably one of the few instances where we adopt magic words testing. If you're communicating your personal view, I always tell people to steer away from the imperial we. Don't say "we oppose House Bill 1." You have to say "I oppose House Bill 1." Now, it's perfectly fine to say, "Hi, I'm Robert Lang. I'm the Deputy Director of the Campaign Finance Commission, and I hate House Bill 1. You should not pass it." Because although I've identified that I'm with a group, I'm not saying I represent the group. Now, if I come in and say, "Hi, I'm Robert Lang. I'm Deputy Director of the Campaign Finance Commission, and the Commission opposes House Bill 1, or we oppose House Bill 1, then you've crossed over into that overt act of lobbying because you're representing your client, not just yourself. So that would be the best advice I can give on that one. Just make sure you are truly saying "I" and avoid "we." I actually had to call my bishop on that one because he was making the mistake of saying "we." And it's like, "No, bishop, sorry, you have to say "I." And then he reminded me he'd see me at mass. Now, as far as takeaways, I always tell lobbyists, remember that when in doubt, keep your expenditures under $75. If you have just a momentary freeze of, "Oh my God, can I do this?" If you keep it under $75, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be perfectly fine, especially since a lot of sporting events are going to cost more than $75 to send them there anyway. Make sure that you always review your lobbyist disclosure schedule at the beginning of the year and set your reminders, because As I've said before, late fees are steep, and although we've never imposed $13,000, $5, $6, $7, $10,000 has not been unknown, especially because with bi-monthly reporting during session, the late fees rack up quickly. Feel free to reach out to us. And then as far as common pitfalls that everyone tends to fall into, I harp on it a little bit too much, but it's the caucuses. Make sure that if you are taking an entire caucus out and spending more than $75 per person per day, make sure it's a real caucus. The House and Senate Ethics Committees will answer that question for you. I think so will the clerk of the Senate and the House as well will be able to provide you with a list. And I can tell you right now, there are only the three. So the House Republicans, the Democratic House, and then the Black Legislative Caucus. Other than that, they all haven't bothered to register. And then again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to give us a call directly. Our contact information is contained in the PowerPoint slide. We're always happy to answer your questions or your friends' questions.
Well, that's all that we have for today. Thank you, Robert.
Thank y'all for having me.